Madam Speaker, the role of the opposition is key to our system of parliamentary democracy. As Wilfrid Laurier put it so succinctly, it is indeed essential for the country that the shades of opinion which are represented on both sides of this House should be placed as far as possible on a footing of equality, and that we should have a strong opposition to voice the views of those who do not think with the majority. Now, faced with the greatest crisis of our lifetime, we need to hear the voices of all Canadians, Madam Speaker. Malheureusement, les autres partis d'opposition montrent clairement qu'ils ne croient pas la même chose. Aux prochaines élections, ils vont devoir reprendre de leurs actes. Les partisans vont demander pourquoi une vote pour le NPD ou le Bloc est devenue une vote pour les libéraux. In my role as Leader of the Opposition, I have traveled the country and met Canadians from all walks of life. Farmers who feed our cities, veterans who are willing to make the ultimate sacrifice so we can live in peace and freedom. Doctors and nurses who provide comfort and care when we're at our most vulnerable. Small business owners who save and sacrifice to grow their businesses and with them, the Canadian economy. New Canadians whose fondest hope is to see their children avail themselves of opportunities they never had. And workers in essential service areas, bravely putting their communities first and ensuring that we have access to the things we need most during this difficult time. Que ce soit ici à Ottawa, à Regina ou à Québec, je vois constamment que les Canadiens sont les gens les plus altruistes, les plus généreux et les plus travaillants au monde. C'est un honneur de les servir à cette Chambre. Et je souhaite seulement que le gouvernement et les autres partis d'opposition nous laissent faire le travail qui nous a été confié. As Canadians, we are keepers of a proud history, Madam Speaker. We have fought and defeated forces of tyranny and helped to bring peace and freedom around the world. We are the stewards of breathtaking natural beauty, from the Atlantic to the Pacific and to the Arctic. We are the protectors of a rich democracy, one rooted in a commitment to pluralism, personal freedom, and individual responsibility. But those ideals don't just happen, Madam Speaker, and we certainly can't take them for granted. C'est ici, au Parlement, que cet important travail est fait. C'est ici que nous posons les questions difficiles mais nécessaires. C'est ici que nous améliorons la politique publique avec des débats solides. C'est ici que nous assurons que le gouvernement reste concentré sur les besoins et les priorités des Canadiens. Now, this House traces its lineage back some 800 years to a water meadow along the River Thames in Surrey, where King John, faced with a rebellion of disenchanted barons, signed the Magna Carta in 1215. Almost 50 years later, in January 1265, the first example of something akin to the modern House of Commons sat in London. While democracy has unquestionably evolved in the intervening centuries, one of the few constants amidst this change is that the House of Commons always meets in person. It met during the cataclysm of the First World War that violently ended a century of relative peace and prosperity. It met when the threat of Nazi Germany set fire to the world with their blood-soaked march through Europe, Russia, and North Africa. It met when tensions between the two superpowers of the day threatened the world with nuclear annihilation. It met through other health pandemics as well, Madam Speaker. Abandoning meetings in person is no simple matter. The recent calls for the House to, quote, just get on Zoom already, brings to mind the words of Winston Churchill. Quote, it is difficult to explain this to those who do not know our ways. They cannot easily be made to understand why we consider that the intensity, the passion, the intimacy, informality, and spontaneity of our debates constitute the personality of the House of Commons and endow it at once with its focus and its strength. Madam Speaker, Parliament must meet. Its role and its place are fundamental. This House, our elected legislature, is the beating heart of our system of government. It's where the viewpoints from all corners of the country have their voice, and where the executive government accounts for its choices, priorities, and its actions. As political scientist Christian Luprecht said in his testimony last month to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs, this role is even more critical during times of crises. Quote, "The underlying primary constitutional principle here is the principle of responsible government. It is about ministerial responsibility, first and foremost. During a crisis and an emergency, especially during a time of crisis, Parliament has a supreme duty to hold the executive to account. Canadians need continuous parliamentary audit of the executive and the bureaucracy's judgment." The official opposition could not agree more, Madam Speaker. Canada's democratic institutions should never be treated as an inconvenience. The House of Commons needs to be functioning and needs to be seen to be functioning during this crisis. Contrary to what the Liberals, NDP, and the Bloc may think, this House is an essential service to the country, and we, its members, are essential workers. And Madam Speaker, I just have to say, I have never seen so many members of Parliament work so hard during an election campaign to get elected, and then work hard to not have to work hard, Madam Speaker. They have spent the last few weeks making arguments, telling Canadians that they shouldn't be doing their job during this time of crisis. Even this week, they are arguing against the return of Parliament. Even as more and more provincial health restrictions are lifted, they are still making the case that Parliament can't do its job. I have a friend who's going back to work at Mattress Mart today, Madam Speaker. You can take your pet to a dog groomer's in Ontario, but somehow Liberals, NDP, and Bloc MPs are saying that we can't do our job here. While Conservatives disagree with that, Madam Speaker, we believe members of Parliament should be showing up to work in this House and a full return to parliamentary functions. The simple act of asking questions and of knowing that questions must be answered requires a government to up its game. Asking questions and giving voice to concerns generates constructive solutions to policy shortcomings. Avec la COVID-19, les efforts de l'opposition ont permis d'augmenter la subvention salariale et le soutien aux étudiants, de réduire les pénalités pour les travailleurs à temps partiel, d'empêcher que les nouveaux parents perdent leurs prestations, d'autoriser les caisses populaires à offrir des prêts et de connecter les employeurs et employés potentiels. Ce sont des améliorations importantes pour les Canadiens et elles viennent tous des questions que les députés de l'opposition ont posées sur les programmes du gouvernement. In the last few weeks, government scrutiny has largely been left to press conferences that the Prime Minister controls. The Prime Minister hosts a morning show at his doorstep, followed by a late show often hosted by the Deputy Prime Minister, for ministers mere feet from this chamber. Unique circumstances may have made this a necessity in the pandemic's first few days. We are long past that. This minority government, however, seems to find it more comfortable to face the parliamentary press gallery than its parliamentary opposition. And to their shame, the NDP and Bloc have so far meekly gone along. Et je suis particulièrement déçu du chef du Bloc québécois. Madame la Présidente, j'ai servi à cette Chambre avec Gilles Duceppe pendant de nombreuses années. Lui et moi n'étions pas toujours d'accord. En fait, je crois que la seule chose sur laquelle nous étions d'accord est que les Québécois forment une nation au sein d'un Canada fort et uni.
Here, here.
Mais, même si nos désaccords étaient nombreux, j'ai éprouvé un certain respect pour M. Duceppe. Il savait que son rôle à cette Chambre, en tant que chef de parti d'opposition, était de demander des comptes du gouvernement. M. Duceppe travaillait fort pour assurer que les gouvernements successifs fassent face à une véritable opposition, même parfois brutale. Il n'avait pas peur de poser des questions difficiles. Il n'hésitait pas à exposer les lacunes des mesures législatives et il n'a jamais fermé les yeux sur les erreurs des libéraux. Cela contraste avec l'actuel chef du Bloc qui, lors du premier tour de négociation, est rentré chez lui pour souper et a donné carte blanche au gouvernement. Les conservateurs sont restés ici toute la nuit et ont perdu des vrais résultats pour les Canadiens. Madam Speaker, Parliament has been getting results for Canadians thanks to the hard work of opposition parties, and it should keep it up. Press conferences aren't a substitute. Around the world, from the United Kingdom to Australia to New Zealand, other countries are resuscitating parliamentary life. Tous les jours, nous voyons le Premier ministre sortir de sa résidence pour annoncer une autre initiative qui coûte des millions de dollars. Selon le Premier ministre, la gestion prudente des finances du Canada par son gouvernement nous permet de dépenser cet argent. C'est une fausse affirmation basée sur de fausses informations. The government isn't drawing money from a rainy day fund, Madam Speaker. And remember, when this government was first elected, it told Canadians that the measure of its fiscal responsibility would be small and temporary deficits, just $10 billion for 4 short years. Well, how'd that work out for them? Those small temporary deficits turned into massive permanent deficits. We went into this pandemic in a weakened state because of this government's wasteful spending. $12 million to Loblaws, $50 million to a credit card company, MasterCard, $50 million to a credit card company that makes its money off of hardworking Canadians who can't afford to pay their full balance. That's who this government showered with riches, Madam Speaker. That's where the money went. Wasteful spending by this Liberal government led to massive deficits, which meant we went into this pandemic in a weakened state. And after it became clear there was no way they were going to be able to hold to their solemn election promise, remember the Prime Minister looking into the eyes of Canadians saying he was being as honest as he possibly could be. Well, we now know what that means, Madam Speaker. Once he knew that there was no way he could hold to that promise, he started to move the goalposts. And then it was all going to be about debt to GDP ratio. As long as the debt to GDP ratio, in other words, the percentage of the national debt as measured against the total economic output of the country, as long as that was under control, Madam Speaker, then everything would be okay. Well, when signs of a recession even before this pandemic, a made-in-Canada recession, started to appear, the government abandoned that as well. So never mind that debt to GDP ratio thing we were talking about just a few minutes ago. It's all about our credit rating, Madam Speaker. As long as we still have that credit rating, we'll be okay. I remember a comedian who used to say, how can I be broke if I still have checks in my checkbook? That is the example that this Prime Minister is giving to Canadians. Well, what about that credit rating, Madam Speaker? Well, we know that we are in rough shape throughout this pandemic because of the extra pressures that have been put on the fiscal system. This government was borrowing and spending with abandon well before the pandemic hit. As the Parliamentary Budget Officer announced last week, the national debt could top $1 trillion by the time this crisis ends. $1 trillion, Madam Speaker. The Prime Minister added $87 billion of debt during his first 4 years of power, and this year he will pile on at least a staggering $252 billion. That's according to the Parliamentary Budget Officer. So this year's deficit could reach $300 billion, $400 billion. We don't know. Government refuses to give us an update, refuses to give us even a fiscal update, never mind a full budget, Madam Speaker. The risks are enormous, and we are starting to see signs of a credit downgrade. And normally, a government running a deficit equal to 12% of GDP or more would see a massive surge in borrowing costs. A government normally would have to go out and outbid the private sector for those funds. They'd have to borrow that money and compete with other people and other institutions borrowing money. But right now, we have a scenario in which the Bank of Canada is creating digital money to buy up government debt, at least $5 billion a week. The Bank of Canada is not just buying federal debt, Madam Speaker. They're buying corporate bonds, provincial government bonds, mortgage debt, commercial paper, bankers' acceptances. The Bank of Canada has bought up so much of this that the total assets they now hold increased from $120 billion at the beginning of March to $442 billion by last week. they've almost quadrupled their balance sheet in just 2 months. This is the biggest expansion of the money supply in such a short period in Canadian financial system history. Now, this is nothing new. Governments have done this throughout history. You can look back to Roman times when emperors would add more and more lead into the currency to keep up with government spending. The actions of the Bank of Canada are going to have an impact. We'd like to know what those impacts are. We would like to know what the consequences are. We have important questions in this chamber, in this parliament, as the role of the official opposition, so that Canadians can understand the consequences of all the options that the government is pursuing. How will the bank unwind all this stimulus? Will we see inflation, currency depreciation? We are deeply worried about the impacts this will have in the long term. Are Canadians and businesses getting the help they need? Are we actually protecting jobs with these programs? Are we preparing the ground for the reopening and the revitalization of our economy? When we conservatives ask hard questions, it's because the well-being of Canadians, their health, and their jobs, our financial system, depend on it. In a crisis, more than ever, those hard questions are critical. I want to highlight several real examples. Clear-eyed foreign policy has real, tangible results. Conservatives see the world as it is, not the way we wish it were. We saw the real consequences of the Prime Minister's weakness on China. Our citizens imprisoned, our trade interests and Canadian farmers hurt by unjustified import blockades. And then the global pandemic began. In Australia and New Zealand, they did not believe the false information coming out of the PRC and repeated by the WHO that there was no human-to-human transmission of COVID-19. In early February, Australia banned visitors from mainland China. Similarly, New Zealand imposed a ban on foreign nationals entering the country from that country as well. Now, no one would characterize the Prime Minister of New Zealand as a conservative hardliner or a foreign policy hawk, but she was rightly skeptical about information coming from a communist authoritarian regime that imprisons doctors for speaking out about the true nature of this virus. Here in Canada, the Prime Minister sided with the PRC. There was to be no ban on travel from that country, no restrictions at all. And a full month later, he was still defending that decision. Despite opposition calls, the Liberals refused to impose mandatory quarantines. The Prime Minister and his ministers dodged questions and maintained that enhanced screening measures were in place. But there were endless reports on social media about Canadians returning from the most affected countries without even being asked any questions. By mid-March, Quebec, Alberta, and Nova Scotia had all sent provincial health officials to airports because the federal government was not doing its job. And by the time the federal government reversed course and finally announced a ban on international visitors, it was already too late. Just last week, the country's chief public health officer said that quicker action could have been taken in responding to the global pandemic. And that action might have saved lives. Today, New Zealand has 0 new cases. They had a total of 21 deaths. Australia still has a few new cases, and they have seen a total of 102 deaths. In Canada, more than 6,500 people have died to date. Throughout this health crisis, the federal government has either been wrong or slow to act. Wrong to dump medical supplies without replacing them. Slow to close our borders. Slow to advise Canadians that they should wear masks after being wrong about telling them not to. Slow to roll out programs to help Canadians who are struggling, and still, so far, no fixes to the gaps that people are finding themselves falling through. We have proposed concrete solutions to help those programs capture more people. So far, this government has been extremely slow to make those changes. That is why parliamentary scrutiny is so important. We can get better results for Canadians, but to do so, the House must sit. Provinces are now easing health restrictions and reopening. So where is the federal government's plan to support them and to do the same? Canadians are optimistic people, Madam Speaker, and they want to see the federal government show signs of that optimism by supporting provincial government plans. There is no plan to stimulate and attract business investment, to create jobs, to help restaurants and retailers reopen, or to give entrepreneurs hope. Clearly, Madam Speaker, we cannot just wish away the virus, but we can restart and re-energize our economy through adaptation, through increased testing and contact tracing, through masking, and through other adaptations. People can get back to work while staying safe. Now, when we emerge from this crisis, Madam Speaker, Canada will find itself at a crossroads. Will we continue down the Liberals' chosen path of government knows best, of ever greater spending, even higher taxes, and ever-growing government? Or will we rebuild civil society, revitalize our communities, and recharge the economy by embracing the proven formula of liberty, personal responsibility, and limited government, Madam Speaker? As former British Prime Minister David Cameron said, a bigger society, not a bigger government. Les autres partis peuvent dire combien ils aiment les gens, mais il est clair qu'ils ne croient pas beaucoup en eux. Les conservateurs, en revanche, ont une grande confiance dans la capacité des gens à prendre des décisions responsables et à gérer leur propre vie. Nous croyons en son avenir. Et nous faisons confiance au talent et à l'ingéniosité des Canadiens et des Canadiens pour aller de l'avant. Canadians are an endlessly enterprising people, Madam Speaker. Perhaps it's a product of our immigrant society, where people leave the familiarity of a home for a shot at a better life on the other side of the world and then work hard to achieve it. Perhaps it's the inspiration we take from Indigenous peoples, resilient men and women who built Canada's first communities in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Perhaps it's our spiritual inheritance that emphasizes individual sanctification, not the creation of a perfect system or utopia here on earth as the path to a better world. Peu importe la raison, les Canadiens ne cessent de montrer que, s'ils sont libérés du contrôle et de la réglementation de l'État, ils vont trouver des façons de s'occuper et non seulement de répondre à leurs besoins essentiels, mais de créer une prospérité et un bien-être qui auraient été impensables il y a quelques générations. Again, we only need to look to our history for inspiration. Freed from the top-down control and the high taxes of the national program, Canadian industry and society began to flourish, drawing immigrants and capital from around the world. In 1939 and 1940, freed from the regulation and the government burden of the Great Depression, Canadians found ways to industrialize our economy and meet the needs of not only defeating tyranny, but then liberating Europe from want. Freed from the government's all-encompassing war effort following the defeat of the Axis powers, Canadians built one of the most prosperous and peaceful societies the world has ever known. In the mid-1980s, freed from the abusive and destructive regulation of Pierre Trudeau's national energy policy, Canada's energy sector embarked on 35 years of growth, innovation, and environmental sustainability that was only ended by this government's heavy-handed intervention, Madam Speaker. The free market is the greatest wealth creation enterprise ever developed. Individuals buying and selling freely, choosing what to exchange their goods and services for, is the primary source of wealth and prosperity. That is what lifts people out of poverty, Madam Speaker. Voluntary exchange always enriches both the seller and the buyer. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. You know, there's a great, as we contemplate how much faith to put in government to get us out of the economic crisis, I'm reminded of a fantastic story that Yuval Noah Harari recounts in a book of his called Homo Deus, and it relates a story of officials coming from the Soviet Union to study the United Kingdom, to study systems. This was during Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost period. And the story goes something like this. The British hosts were taking these Soviet officials around London. They were showing them different things, London School of Economics, the stock exchange, and this one particular official was getting more and more puzzled by something as they were driving around London. So he finally stops and says, listen, I just have a very important question. We've been going back and forth across London for a whole day now, and there's one thing I can't understand. Back in Moscow, our finest minds are working on the bread supply system. And yet there are still such long queues in every bakery and grocery store. So please, take me to the person who's in charge of the bread supply in London. Take me to the person. I want to meet the person. I want to learn the secret of how a city this big, this vibrant, ensures that its people has bread every day. Of course, the British officials were puzzled. There was no such person, Madam Speaker. There was no one person in charge of something as important as the bread supply in London. The free market did that. And to someone who, especially at that period of time, Madam Speaker, especially in that system, where the state controlled everything, that was inconceivable. How could you leave to chance something so important as feeding the people of a city, Madam Speaker? That is what the free market does. The free market takes care of the needs of people instantaneously. The invisible hand ensuring that people who have particular skills employ those skills to the benefit of everyone else. We are all far more better off from the work of individual producers than that person themselves. The clothes we wear, the tools we have, the iPhones we have, our lives are enriched by the free market, by people buying and selling goods freely. In a free market, there is no overarching central plan for the whole. The larger outcome, plentiful, affordable goods, is ordered seemingly out of chaos. But it is free people pursuing their enterprising natures that provides for our needs. And that's why it is so imperative that we embrace those principles as our economy reopens. Once the COVID-19 crisis has passed and we've had time to reflect, I'm confident we'll better appreciate the importance of freedom in building safe and resilient societies. Freedom does not just give space for the creation of a great economy. Freedom creates space for the emergence of a great society. Madam Speaker, let's remember that it was the Chinese regime's oppression of freedom that led it to silence the doctors who tried to raise the alarm about a terrifying new virus in Wuhan. It was the PRC's regime of oppression of freedom that led it to intimidate the brave few doctors who were raising the alarm, who felt obliged to warn the rest of the world. It was the communist regime's oppression of freedom that led it to put pressure on the World Health Organization to repeat that government's talking points and to undermine the global response to the pandemic. We must never, countries around the world must never forget the corrosive effect the PRC's oppression of its own people has had on the entire world. Hundreds of thousands of people have died terrible deaths, oftentimes without the comfort of their loved ones at their bedside. And the actions of the PRC have made that worse. The global economy has imploded with hundreds of millions of people losing their jobs and their savings. No one, I hope, Madam Speaker, I hope no one ever expresses admiration for China's basic dictatorship ever again. And I trust that those who do have learned the gravity of their mistake. Madam Speaker, there is no secret formula to human advancement. We have a choice. We have a choice right now. As history has proven time and time again, freedom, liberty, and democratic government are the surest path to human flourishing and prosperity. Let's look at the things that this government was directly responsible for. Borders, they left them open, refused to put travel restrictions on. They were so slow putting in airport screening. Dozens and dozens of plane loads of people coming in from highly affected area were met with normal operations at the border, at those airports. The pandemic stockpile, the government was in charge of that too. And what do? They dump millions of pieces in a dumpster. We only know this because in my hometown of Regina, someone who owned a dumpster company put a bid in to get the contract to dispose of millions of pieces of personal protective equipment. Programs that this government have put in with major gaps and impediments to people being able to survive this pandemic economically. People who earn $1 more than $1,000 lose their entire CERB benefit. Small businesses unable to access programs like the wage subsidy or rental relief programs. So what is that proven formula, Madam Speaker? Well, it's lowering taxes. It's leaving money in the economy where it will always do more good than in the hands of a government official. A dollar left in the hands of the hardworking taxpayer who earned it is always better spent than in the hands of a politician who taxed it. It means getting rid of duplicate regulations, Madam Speaker. The government has so many brakes on the economy that serve no public policy interest. Duplication at federal and provincial levels. We need to get government out of the way to allow for dynamic growth to return. Part of that, Madam Speaker, includes the impediments that this government has put on the energy sector. The energy sector, prior to this pandemic, had $25 billion worth of applications sitting on government desks. That's money that was not being put to good use. That was investments that were hanging in the balance. You know, this government likes to talk a lot about the overall debt to GDP burden, but remember, there is only one economy in Canada. And as our Shadow Minister for Finance had a great metaphor the other day, Madam Speaker. He's talking about, the government focuses on federal debt to GDP ratio. Well, that's ballooned. Also, the economy is shrinking during this time, so that proportion is changing. But then you have to add to that all the provincial debt, all the municipal debt, all the individual debt, and the corporate debt. If you think of the economy as a horse, Madam Speaker, and everyone is saddling more and more debt on that horse, trying to pull everything up the mountain, at a certain point, it can't, especially when you stop feeding the horse. And at least in the last downturn, Madam Speaker, at least in the Great Recession of 2008, the Great Global Recession, this government, the previous Conservative government, recognized that we need to strengthen the economy pulling the cart up the hill. And we recognized that you could do that by ensuring that the energy sector was vibrant. In fact, Madam Speaker, if you look at the stats, it's astounding. Since 2000 to 2018, Canada's oil and gas production industry directly paid almost $240 billion to provincial governments and $66 billion to Ottawa. And in addition, its employees paid nearly $54 billion in federal and provincial taxes. So according to Statistics Canada, the energy industries provided $65.9 billion in federal corporate taxes alone, more than banking, more than construction, and more than real estate, Madam Speaker. That was our low tax plan. We kept taxes low, we eliminated wasteful and duplicate regulations, and I see, Madam Speaker, that it's almost 2 o'clock, and we're going to start statements by members in a few moments. So why don't I stop here, Madam Speaker, and I'll resume after question period, because I still have some more great points about the benefits of freedom and the free market, bringing Canada out of this economic difficulty. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I believe just before question period, I was talking about the effect of all the accumulated debt. And I'd like to go back to that, but I just wanted to touch on a few things that came up out of question period and in the debate that we've just had today. Obviously, as it relates to the global reaction to the coronavirus, COVID-19, there are a lot of questions about the role of the Communist government of China, how they suppressed information in the early days, how they punished whistleblowers, doctors who were uploading videos, warning the world about the dangers of this virus, have suddenly disappeared. Those are people's spouses, brothers, sisters, children. They're gone. We know what happens to people who disappear in communist countries, Mr. Speaker, and we can only hope and pray that those individuals will be unharmed and freed soon. But what happened today in question period was very, very upsetting. I put it to the Prime Minister several times that this would be an opportunity for him to condemn the actions of the Communist government of China, violating the rights and freedoms of the people of Hong Kong. Not to express concerns, not to issue a statement calling for a de-escalation, but calling out wrong as it exists, calling out evil as it exists. The refusal to do so diminishes and downplays the egregious attack on the rights and freedoms of the people of Hong Kong that the PRC has just engaged in. It it makes it seem like this is like a normal dispute. Canada raises concerns all the time about things that are going on around the world. Raising concern is a very polite diplomatic expression. But condemning the actions of the PRC is what is required to send a clear signal around the world that freedom-loving countries will stand together against this act, this aggressive act. The Prime Minister refused to do so. So, the government talks a good game often, but when the chips are down, when real action is required, this is what we saw today. We had an opportunity to send a clear condemnation. That would also send a signal to the people of Hong Kong that they're not alone. And there are hundreds of thousands of Canadian citizens in Hong Kong who are now having their rights and freedoms infringed. They're looking to this government to be their voice, and this government failed to do so. So, Mr. Speaker, I hope that in the coming days, the pressure that the opposition party puts on the government will reluctantly force them to do the bad thing. We know that is one thing they do pay attention to. They do pay attention when public opinion starts to shift. The Liberals say, well, you didn't like our principles before. Well, how about these ones? And they're now claiming that they have been raising some of these concerns about China. But let's not forget that for the past almost 5 years now, this government has pursued a policy of appeasement as it relates to the PRC. This Prime Minister went over to China in pursuit of a free trade deal. Despite the fact that many people were warning about a free trade deal with a country that has so many state-owned enterprises, that subsidizes, that uses state-owned companies to pursue the political goals of the government of China. Despite the fact that the companies who operate in China do not face the same environmental or labor standards as they do here, despite the fact that those companies are not subject to the same accountability and disclosure laws that we have in Canada. Of course, the Prime Minister, who was given a loving nickname of the little potato by the PRC, came home empty-handed, so even failed to achieve his own objective, which we disagree with the objective, so we're glad that he came home without a deal, but it still just displayed the level of respect that other world leaders have for this current Prime Minister. So we're going to keep it up, Mr. Speaker, but remember, they started out trying to pursue that free trade deal, and then along the way, the government of China put blocks on our exports. They blocked our canola exports. They've threatened to take similar action. All the while, 2 Canadian citizens are being held illegally. And you think this Prime Minister would do something? I mean, I wish we were having a debate on whether or not the reaction of the Liberal government was appropriate or not. I wish we could say, well, these are our ideas, they have their ideas, let's have a debate as to whose ideas are better to stand up for Canada, to show the government of China there are consequences for violating international rules of law. But they've done nothing. We can't debate their ideas versus ideas because their idea is to continue to do absolutely nothing. Worse than that, they are continuing to pursue the policy of appeasement, which includes taking over $250 million out of the Canadian economy, out of the pockets of taxpayers here in Canada, to build roads and bridges in other countries, to further the interests of the PRC. The Communist government of China has a Belt and Road policy. They are expanding their reach. They have a game plan that has been put to use where they build critical infrastructure in developing countries. When those countries face any kind of financial difficulty or are unable to pay, the government of China seizes those assets, and now they've got footholds in different regions around the world. We're very concerned about the string of pearls policy of the government, which is aimed at encircling another democratic country in the region of India. So, Mr. Speaker, we're going to keep up the pressure. We hope that the government will listen to us, but in the next election, there will be a clear contrast before the Canadian people. Continued do-nothing approach of the Liberal government, letting Canadians down here in Canada, letting farmers down, letting exporters of canola and other products down, the 2 Canadians who are held illegally, letting them down, and letting down people in this country who want to see Canada to be that champion for human rights and freedoms around the world. So we're going to keep up the pressure on our end, Mr. Speaker. When I was speaking to the motion before, I was talking about the fallacy of the Liberal government's usage of the debt to GDP ratio as a way of assuring Canadians not to worry. And I believe just before a question period, I was talking about how the federal government debt is just but a small part of that debt to GDP ratio. The federal government debt is just one saddle on that horse, the engine of our economy, the economy that has to pull everything along. In addition to federal government debt, we've got provincial debt, and we've got corporate debt. We also have individual debt. So at the very least, we should stop saddling the horse with more debt. We should stop putting more and more weight on it. In the meantime, when we're thinking about how we emerge out of this downturn, we need to be thinking about how we can supercharge the economy, how we can really tap into the entrepreneurship, the hard work of Canadians, freeing them to do what they do best, what they have done best throughout history. And that's where we really get into a debate over the role of government. And I think that is fundamentally the biggest difference between Conservatives and Liberals. Whatever we call ourselves at any particular moment in time. In Canada, it's Liberals and Conservatives. In other countries, the political parties have different names. But all throughout human history, this has been the essential question, the role of government. And the problem is there are so many people who confuse society and government. They blend them both together. They think that if society should do something, or if we want society to behave to be a certain way or to do a certain thing, that it's the government's job to do that. They blend the two together. In reality, the two couldn't be more different. Not only are they different in substance and nature, but their origins are different. Where society comes from is diametrically opposed to where government comes from. Society comes from the positive elements of human nature, the good aspects of human nature. Society is built around human beings interacting in a positive way. A buyer and a seller, a friend getting together, a group of people with common interests, creating a club or a society to enjoy music, literature, the arts. That's what society is. Society is people coming together in a positive way. Government comes out of our fallen nature. Because we are fallen beings, Mr. Speaker, government is created to address that aspect of human nature. It's there to protect people from the negative aspects of human nature. So we have a police, we have courts, we have institutions to make sure that nobody falls through the cracks. If individuals themselves are not able or willing to be generous to look after those who can't help themselves, then government steps in to provide for those gaps in society. But by definition, it is a creature of our fallen state. And so therefore, we should not put all our faith in that government, Mr. Speaker, in any government, because the nature of government is so much different than society. A colleague of mine, I was walking down the steps here and I saw a book that I read a few years ago. It's a fantastic book. I wish more people in government offices read the book. It's called Economics in One Lesson. It's a fantastic book. I see some of my colleagues may have read it. And I'll go into that in a moment, Mr. Speaker, but I wanted to make a further point about the role of government. You see, we know that perfection is not for this side of eternity. We know that because of human nature, we're never going to create a perfect society here. We can always try to do better. We can always try to improve upon ourselves, challenge ourselves individually and collectively to do that. But I often get asked to participate in the National Prayer Breakfast. Now, I have, when I was Speaker, I enjoyed being the honorary chair of the National Prayer Breakfast and a leader of the opposition. I've been honored to participate as well. I used to always tell the organizers of the National Prayer Breakfast that there really is no bad time to pray. And the start for the National Prayer Breakfast was a 7 a.m. start. And I used to always make the point that, you could have a National Prayer afternoon tea. You could have a National Prayer brunch. We could even do this in the evening, a National Prayer cocktail hour. But they never took me up on my suggestions, Mr. Speaker. But when I was asked to give a bit of a talk this year, I found a passage in Scripture that I think best illustrates this point about the role of government and how government itself comes out of our inability to be perfect beings. That because of that, government is a necessary evil. And if we look at the first book of Samuel, chapter 8 to, I believe, the end of 18, we see that the Israelites ask the Lord for a king. They want to be like the other nations. They ask God to choose one of them to be king so that they can be like other countries and they will have all the majesty that comes with having a worldly king. And so Samuel goes and tells this to God, and this is what happens next. So this is first book of Samuel, chapter 8, verse 10. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, this is the Lord, "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses. They will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." Mr. Speaker, I would take 10%. I mean, that sounds like a steal. That's a bargain compared to what this government has imposed upon Canadians. So, in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I know that probably brings a lot of joy to those on the opposite side too, who don't love freedom as much as we do. You know, I heard something. I heard a member for the NDP say something a few minutes ago, talking about being on the side of the people, being on the side of people, and I think he misses it. He misses a massive point here. The NDP and the left, the Liberals, they always say Margaret Thatcher summed this up perfectly. They always say their slogan is "power to the people." What they really mean is power to the state. They really mean power to the government. They don't actually mean to empower people. Because to empower people is to give them freedom, to give them choices, to give them options. That's what real power to the people means. It means getting the government out of the way. And if someone has a better widget or a better mousetrap, letting them innovate and expand and excel and take their ideas, combine it with their industry, combine it with the capital that they may have raised from their friends and family or the public. That is what creates wealth and prosperity. That is what true freedom is. And let's never forget, the free markets are just as much a democratic institution as other aspects of our society. When I was Speaker of the House of Commons, I met President Sarkozy in France, in Paris, at the height of the financial crisis. And he was talking about the irony that before the financial collapse of 2008, he didn't have a lot of big corporate executives trying to come see him. And but in the downturn, in the aftermath of the downturn, he said there was a path beaten in the lawn from their offices to his office. And he said to them, he was saying to them that they would, if they wanted to have support from the government, that they had to recognize that the government was there on behalf of the people. And I remember saying to him that free markets itself is an expression of intent, and it is an expression of what the people want. When people are free to choose for themselves, when they have the ability to go about their business with minimal government impact, that allows people to express themselves in many different ways. So that's what we've lost in this country, Mr. Speaker. The Liberals are so good at forcing the conversation that always includes an expansion of government control and government power. We've seen it time and time again. There's a great quote in a movie that I'm very fond of, The Usual Suspects, Kevin Spacey. And there's a line near the end of the movie where he says, the greatest trick the devil ever played on people is convincing them that he doesn't exist. And there's kind of a parallel to big government liberals, Mr. Speaker. They trick people into thinking that once the government provides a good or a service, that if the government didn't provide it, it wouldn't get done. But we know the history of human beings is exactly the opposite of that. It's almost always the case that society comes up with solutions to these challenges. And then government comes along, gets in the way, taxes it, regulates it, until the point where they have to step in many situations, and then they tell people, well, if government wasn't doing it, it would never get done. We know that's not true, Mr. Speaker. When you look back at the course of human history, look at the quality of life we have today. And ask my colleagues a question. Where would they rather live at any other time in human history? Was there ever a time when every single human being had it so good? You know, the ability to get fresh fruits and vegetables in the winter, the ability to communicate with people around the world instantaneously, modern medicine curing diseases that took out millions of people just 2 or 3 generations ago. My wife's grandmother is still alive, Mr. Speaker, and she will tell stories about digging a hole in their backyard, putting a block of ice on a little shelf, and that is where they would store their fruits and vegetables for as long as it would last. In the winter, almost everything was pickled or preserved. That was their quality of life. I can speak to someone who lived that lifestyle just a short while ago. But because of free market capitalism, we have seen a massive expanse, a massive increase in the quality of life. And that's what conservatives will be arguing for in the future to get us out of the negative consequences of this pandemic. Under our previous conservative government, Mr. Speaker, when we adopted a low tax strategy, we went in, we lowered taxes every way the government collected it. We left more and more money in the economy. We had a one-for-one rule for government regulations so that these rules that are drawn up in boardrooms in Ottawa that have to apply all across the country, that many of which are outdated or duplicates of provincial regulations, we had a one-for-one rule so that every new regulation that came in, one had to go out to prune the growth of government, to leave more of our economy to the free market. We invested, yes, in critical infrastructure that had the potential and did open up new markets, bridges, roads, ports, all across the country. There are concrete examples of our governments, our previous conservative governments, strategic investments to maximize the growth that would come along with the tax cuts and with the reduction in regulations. Now, what about the results, Mr. Speaker? Well, under our previous conservative government, the number of children living in poverty fell by 31%, the biggest reduction on record. Our tax cuts helped lower income Canadians. In fact, the parliamentary budget officer and financial experts agree that the overwhelming beneficiary of our economic policy were low-income Canadians. The real median wage went up, Mr. Speaker, by 8.6%, and 12% for women, meaning a person earning a median income saw an increase of over $3,800. Under the current Liberal government, wages have barely budged, up just 2%. So what does that say about their economic policies? And that's one of the biggest problems about this government. They hurt the very people that they claim that they try to help. That's always the problem with big government leftist programs. Their carbon tax, not only did emissions go up under a program that was supposed to reduce them, but it hurts rural people the most and people on lower income. Canceling popular tax credits made it harder for parents to keep their children in activities and sports. After their first changes to the tax code, the richest Canadians actually ended up paying less. He's raised CPP premiums. That's a payroll tax, Mr. Speaker. And the percentage of that increase hits those on lower incomes more than it hits those on higher incomes because of the ceiling on CPP taxable benefits. Remember his attack on small business owners. I heard from so many women entrepreneurs who said that every legitimate tax tool that they were trying to use to grow their business or take over from a family, it demonized them. He called them the Prime Minister called them tax cheats. And of course, all that borrowed money comes with a massive cost. So this is the difference between the two approaches, Mr. Speaker. One, on the Conservative side, where we put our faith in people, recognizing that society is bigger than government. And I hope members opposite can appreciate this. Look at the calamity that has happened with just 3 months worth of a lockdown in Canada. Look at the economic consequences. I hope that allows them to realize that no amount of government spending can ever replace the power of the free market private sector in this country or anywhere else around the world, Mr. Speaker. So, as history has proved time and time again, freedom, liberty, and democratic government are the surest path to prosperity. Now, in the days ahead, other opposition parties may want to shirk their duties, Mr. Speaker. My colleagues and I were elected to do a job, and we're going to continue doing that. Remember the first time this House came together after March 15th. The very first thing these Liberals tried to do, Mr. Speaker, was effectively sideline Parliament, giving themselves unprecedented powers to tax and to borrow and to spend. No other government in Canadian history had tried to do what these Liberals did. And their reaction when they got caught was so telling. They said, oh, that's fine, that's how this is supposed to work. We're supposed to try to do unprecedented power grabs, and you can wrap our knuckles, and we'll come out with a compromise that gives us maybe not everything we're asking for, but more than we had before. They use these crises to benefit themselves politically. And that's what they're doing again today, Mr. Speaker. This is a similar move to sideline Parliament, to reduce the effectiveness of elected representatives during a time when we need more oversight and more accountability. Because every single time the House has got together, Conservatives have improved government programs. We have improved their legislation, we have identified gaps and weaknesses, and we have gotten better results for Canadian people. And that ultimately is what this exercise is about. So while it may not be in this House, Mr. Speaker, should they get their way, Conservatives will continue opposing this government's destructive taxes, reckless spending, and dangerous borrowing. We will continue to stand up for the most vulnerable among us. We will continue to fight for a strong, united Canada that is a force for good in the world. And we will respect the sacred trust and this institution. We will work on behalf of Canadians, and we will do everything we can to defend this democratic institution that has served this country so well through so many challenges in the past. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Merci beaucoup.